A number of years ago, I had the opportunity to be a mentor for a group of preachers, seminarians from our Episcopal seminaries, and we would gather at different places throughout the country for an opportunity, what they refer to jokingly as preacher camp. And what you had, the seminarians had to bring a sermon with them. And then those who were part of the faculty, that included the teachers of homiletics who would show up, and also parish clergy, somewhat. And we had to bring a sermon also, because our job was to hear the preachers preaching, critique them, and then we didn't get off easily. We had to preach at either evensong or at the Eucharist, at daily Eucharist. And it's very humbling to have someone who is still in seminary look at and listen to your sermon and say, "You could have done better, right?" In our preaching group, there was a young man named Matthew. And Matthew was at the Church Divinity School of the Pacific out near in California. And in his homily, he was bringing forth the fact that he did his clinical pastoral work at a prison just outside of San Francisco. And he was involved in Bible study, working with convicts, some pretty rough characters. There were some murderers, rapists, people who were in for a long period of time. And at first you may sit there and shake your head saying, I can't believe people actually do a Bible study in a prison, much less people of that nature or those crimes. And yet Matt found a way to reach out to these men in this prison in such a way as to get anywhere from 25 to 50 people to sit down and to hear the word and to discuss the word. Now you may wonder what kind of what they brought to the meeting. Maybe they just needed some time away. Maybe they just wanted to idle some time away and not be out in the yard or have people harassing them. But regardless of the fact, Matt was there with 25 to 50 people. Well, being a seminarian and being used to the daily Eucharist and daily offices, he wanted to bring the Eucharist to his class. And so he thought, what better way to do it than let's go to the Bishop of the Northern California and see if they could spring loose a priest who would come and say Mass for these convicts. So he went to his diocese and he knocked on the bishop's door and he went through all the chairs and whatever and found out there was nobody that could come out to the prison and say Mass for them. He said, "You got to be kidding me." He said, no, we're all very, very busy. And he said, all right. So he went to the Archdiocese of San Francisco and he asked if there was a priest there that might be able to be sprung loose, they could come and say Mass and whatever. And they were too busy also. They just couldn't get to the prison. It's just out of their way. They couldn't possibly be bothered. And Matt said, I was really heartbroken. He said, heartbroken for my convicts, my people, my clients. He said, but heartbroken over the fact that the people of God somehow or other were left out. That somehow or other, because of who they were and what they were and where they were, that maybe people who were nice like us just didn't want to associate with them. And that got him upset. And he said, you know what? We're not going to have a Eucharist. We'll have an agape, a love feast as found in the book of Acts. We'll have bread and we'll have wine. We'll just have no one there to consecrate it. And so what Matt did is he made his own bread. And with the bread, each time he made a loaf, he would pound it and beat on it and scream at it and curse at it. And the tears would be coming down his face, saying how people can be so selfish and so undignified. And how could they do this? And how could they do that? And he said, took a lot of frustration out. It felt good about that. He said, then he tried one more time. He took the bread, he baked it, he had it all ready to go, and he got his bottle of wine, he was going to bring it to the prison. And he found a Franciscan friary, Roman Catholic Franciscan friary in the San Francisco area, Bay Area. And he found a little old Franciscan, probably St. Francis himself, God only knows. And he said to him, is it possible that you might be able, not even once a week, but just once a month, to go and say Mass for these prisoners? He said it would mean a lot to me personally, but also to them, to hear the word and say that they indeed, in spite of their sins, in spite of what they've done, that indeed that they had some merit, some wealth, some understanding, some worth in this life. And the Franciscan agreed, and he went to say Mass. And he said, and there we were, he said, with this bread of affliction, which really what it was, had literally been cried over and sweated over and beaten out. He said, and here was this little priest, all decked out in his Franciscan robes and his habit, I should say, and then had his Eucharistic there, And he said, Matt, I got the privilege of reading the gospel. He said, and I got to preach. And he said, and I got standing O from my crowd. He said, it was one of those things where it really was a grace-filled moment, where he thought it was going to be just an ugly time, where he'd have to disappoint his crowd. The bread that he beat, the dough, they keep beating on it, really was the bread of affliction. It really was a sense of sorrow that was felt in that. Not unlike what we heard in the gospel just a moment ago. Here at Jesus on the mount, looking over and seeing the Mount Tabor in the background, Mount Hermon in the background, seeing the Sea of Galilee at his feet, sitting around and talking to his disciples, and seeing this crowd of people coming at him. During the Passover season, people are heading toward Jerusalem. They're starting to come down and they're coming through the crowd. They heard about Jesus. They heard about the miracles he had done. They heard about the healings that had taken place. They heard about the preaching. They heard that when people walked away from after hearing Jesus, they felt that their lives were going to be changed. They felt that there was some value to the lives that they lived. And being Passover, the time when the bread of affliction was being offered, when the matzah was being offered on the first night of Passover, the second night of Passover, as the matzahs were being broken, they were reminded of the fact that there was a Moses who led the people of Israel out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, with the power of Almighty God behind him. And there is Jesus on the mountaintop, with the disciples around him, and people coming to hear the word. So Jesus turns to Philip and he says, where do we buy bread that these may eat? And Philip looks around and says, we don't have enough money. We got about $200 amongst us, and that wouldn't be enough to give them all just a little bit, a little taste. And then Andrew comes running up. He says, the lad here has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. What are they among so many? Now you know the story. You've heard it just a moment ago, and you probably told it to your children or your grandchildren. Maybe you enjoyed reading it in the scripture yourself. How the miraculous comes out of the everyday. Out of affliction, the bread of affliction suddenly takes on a new light. So Jesus says, make the people sit down. So the people sat down, about 5,000. Jesus takes the bread from the kid and the fish. Nobody says what the kid was feeling, but that's another story. He takes the bread, takes it, blesses it, breaks it, distributes it. 5,000 people are fed. Then Jesus says to the disciples, gather up the fragments that remain and nothing be lost. And they gather up the fragments. 12 baskets are filled. 12 baskets, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles. Everything is gathered up. Nothing is wasted. And people were fed. The bread of affliction now becomes the bread of life. Now the people are excited. They look at Jesus and say, want to make him king. Jesus says, this isn't going to happen, guys. And he bags it. He gets out of there. The disciples can't find Jesus. And they say, well, we got to get going anyway. We've got to be heading across. They get in the boat. And they start heading across the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias. As happens sometimes, though, the winds come down from the north country across the Sea of Galilee. And sometimes they come down unexpectedly in such a way that they really will cause the waves to really pick up, which is rare for a lake, but unbelievable. And the waves start picking up. It's kind of like, have you ever been in Lake Superior in late summertime up in Michigan? And when the winds start blowing in from Canada, and all of a sudden this lake just picks up and waves like you think you're in the ocean. Same kind of thing happens in the Sea of Galilee. And so the disciples are having trouble. They're up against headwinds. The boat's not moving. All of a sudden they turn and look, and there's Jesus walking across the water. They thought he was a ghost. Jesus continues to walk, and they invite him into the boat. First he says to him, he says, don't be afraid. It is I, ego eimi, Yahweh, God in your midst. The winds stop. The boat miraculously gets across to the other side. The disciples get out. Jesus gets out. The power of this story is the fact that Jesus has the authority over the nature. Jesus has the authority over humankind. Jesus has the authority to take the natural things that are around and bless them and break them and distribute them in such a way so that the people of God are fed. The bread of affliction that is celebrated at Passover now becomes the bread of life. And the people of God are fed. The disciples hear it one more time. The convicts heard it loud and clear. So many years ago, when Matt was able to break the bread and offer the bread to those who were around him, and indeed offer the cup. Isn't it ironic? In the Gospel of John, you have the miraculous multiplication of the loaves, where earlier in the Gospel of John, in chapter 2, you had the miraculous draught of wine. Remember that story? Jesus' mother says to him, they've run out of wine at the wedding. Jesus says, what's the problem? He says, it's not my wedding. I'm here as a guest. What does he say to his mother? What is that to me? Wouldn't you love to say that to your mother and still keep your head on your shoulders? He's able to take the water, he blesses the water, it becomes the wine. Isn't it ironic that there's no Eucharistic story about the Last Supper in John's account of the gospel? So you have it in chapter 2 with the blessing of the water becoming wine, and you have it in chapter 6 with the miraculous multiplication of loaves. The bread of affliction becomes the bread of life. Do not be afraid. I am He. I am Yahweh. I am God in your very midst. I have the authority over nature. I have the authority over humankind to feed all of humankind so that they may have the sense of goodness that only God can offer. We are the people of God. We are the people of God who are fed week in and week out when we come to His table. We are the people of God who take the affliction of this world and offer that on the altar in such a way that is transposed and transformed so that we receive the body and blood of Christ. And then the commitment to go from this place renewed in the power of God's presence. To go out into the world and not say no, as so many clergy said to my friend Matt. Instead of saying no, to turn around and say yes. When the people of God gather, there's a miraculous understanding of who we are in Christ's name. Something mystical about this Eucharist that we celebrate. A number of years ago, when I was ordained to the priesthood, I was in a parish that was a very strong Anglo-Catholic parish. What was important about that is they used to have a daily Eucharist, daily Mass. And the weekend of my ordination, I was ordained on Saturday, and we had 300-400 people jammed in the church. We had an overflow crowd in the parish hall. We had closed-circuit television. I was looking good. You had it. It was great. It was powerful. The Goldbergs came down from Boston. You got to love that. The Jewish part of the family all came down. They didn't know what was going on, but they had a ball. They had a great time. Sunday came to celebrate the first Eucharist, and it was outstanding. I got to tell you, Jesus would have been pleased. Incense, bells, vested clergy. We wore berettas and things like this. You couldn't believe how great it was. The candles, we had it in abundance. And the boss said to me, he said, now that you've been priested, he said, you're put on the rota to celebrate one of the daily masses, or a couple of the daily masses during the week. You've got Monday morning at 7:30. He said, I'm going to sleep in. No problem, boss. I'll be there. Man, I'm excited. Are you kidding? This has been a great weekend. So, as it turned out, Monday morning came. I got to the church a little after 7, opened the place up, turned on the lights, turned on the heat, lit the candles, got my vestments on. 7:30 came. I walked out. 4 people. 300 people the day before. 400 people the day before that. 4 people. Celebrated Eucharist. Finished up. They left. I locked up, shut the heat off, put the lights off, put out the candles. Went across to the diner, grabbed a little breakfast, came back, got to the office a little before 9. The boss's office is right next to mine, banging on the wall. He says, Father, come on in, I want to talk. It's okay. I came in and talked. He says, how was it? I says, boss, this is the greatest weekend of my life. I said, the Goldbergs are here. I said, the rest of the Christian side of the family. I said, we had parties like you couldn't believe. The Goldbergs party. They really had a great time that weekend. My mother was in her glory. She says, how did it go this morning? I said, we had 4 people. He says, and that's the people of God. And they'll be here almost every day. And they will come because you are offering the bread and the cup. He said, that's what the people of God do. When we hear these miraculous stories, when we hear the story of the feeding of the 5,000, and if you're reading Matthew and Mark, they like this so much they have a feeding of the 4,000 on top of it. Did you know that? Feeding of the 4,000. So that way the Jews and the Gentiles both get fed. So you got 9,000 people in Mark and Matthew who are being fed. Not even a free will offering taken up. They just gave the food. The power that's behind these stories, the sense of the miraculous, is what we live for as the people of God. It's what we come to celebrate. And we celebrate that as we come to the Lord's table. As we break the bread and offer the cup. Yeah, I know it's a token. It's a token little host and a token sip of wine. But it sets us up for what we celebrate at our tables, day in and day out. It gives us the opportunity to celebrate, an opportunity to offer thanks for what God has given us. We were at a conference a couple of months ago with talking about Muslims and Christians. And the man who was leading the conference had been a Lebanese citizen and was experienced with the world of Islam became a Christian, came to this country, and he's developed this program of reaching out to Muslims. And he said, what is it that you offer to the world as Christians? We all kind of looked around and thinking, where's the right answer on this one, you know? Horrible thing to ask Christians, clergy, what their Christianity is all about. He says, you guys pray. He said, you pray at least 3 times a day. And he said, I'm thinking, what's he looking in our window for? He said, you pray, you offer your grace at breakfast, you offer your grace at lunch, you offer your grace at dinner. He said, you're offering thanksgiving as only God can give you. He said, and that's what we do as Christians. We offer God's grace, we acknowledge that, we give thanks, and we eat. We celebrate that week in and week out when we come here. We celebrate that sense of good news, where the bread of affliction becomes the bread of life. We celebrate what God can do for us because we believe in the miraculous, and we see the miraculous can take place when we go outside those glass doors to a world that is sadly hurting and still needs to hear the comforting word of Christ. And that's where you and I come in. We are that people of God. We are not afraid. We have welcomed Christ into our lives, onto the boat, and when we've successfully gotten over to the other side, we're able, through the miraculous healing power of Christ, to go forward as only Christ can do. You need to take away from this day, take away the fact of the body and blood of Christ, the bread and the wine. Take away the fact of a seminarian banging away at a piece of bread, kneading his piece of dough, trying to indeed allow all his anger, all his affliction to come out in that. And be reminded that after all that came out, all the pain and all the anger and the frustration, came the glory of the Eucharist that was celebrated, where he was able to reach out to those who he cared for and those whom he loved. And if we're able to do that, then we're truly able to celebrate what it is to be a people of God, because that's what God has called us to do. Through Jesus Christ, he said, it is I. Do not be afraid. Blessed Yahweh, come into our lives once more. Amen.